Good evening, good evening. We've still got quite a few people that we're waiting on, so we'll give it another 10 seconds or so, and then we'll just go ahead and get started, and they can filter in as they can. But thanks for coming out tonight. So this is our webinar on plant identification for Illinois deer hunters, and this is one thing that we talk internally a lot about, and it's one thing that I was blessed. One of my first jobs right out of college was as a botany technician. So I got to spend my summer in the Missouri Ozarks doing nothing but plant identification. It taught me not only a deeper appreciation for the natural resources that we have, but also the relationship between wildlife and plants and vegetation and topography and kind of how all that plays in. And I think it's something that's really important for us as hunters to continue to remind ourselves on is that, hey, the food source that these animals are after are often our plants. And so it's pretty important to have at least a cursory understanding of plant identification of some of the groups and kind of how they may be used by different wildlife species. And so that's really what we're going to spend tonight talking about. And I do want to emphasize just kind of right up front, we're not going through like this is a botany class. I'm not breaking out, plant keys and counting the number of veins and leaves and getting that granular. We're going to take a very like 10,000 foot view at this stuff and just kind of really highlight some of the more common plants that you're likely to come across in Illinois, what they look like, where they can be found, and then again, how deer may use them, whether it's bedding vegetation, whether it's cover, or whether it is one of these food sources. So we'll go ahead and dive right in. And just a reminder, this is going to be recorded and thrown up on YouTube tomorrow. So if you have any questions or want to rewatch it, we'll definitely have that recording up. And if you have any questions while we go through tonight, feel free to drop them in the chat, and Curtis will bring them to my attention, and then we'll kind of answer those as we move through. But first thing I want to start off with, this actually should be the first slide, is just I like to show this illustration really quickly and just mostly to show how diverse the diet is of a white-tailed deer. Now, this specific graphic was put out by the NDA, and it's basically an analysis of 50 different research articles that they kind of combined all the data and basically created this one image. So I just want to set that caveat. If this was focused on Illinois, I would certainly expect crops to be a little bit larger of a percentage kind of across the entire annual gradient there. But I think it really does, again, give an indication on the diversity of plants that deer will eat, whether it's browsing, so that's feeding on twigs, on the tender shoots, the new growth of trees and things like that. That's forbs, so that's your herbaceous vegetation, and then obviously your mast crops, which are going to be your nuts, is going to be your hard mast, and then your soft mats are going to be some of those fruit species that we'll kind of get into. But again, I just wanted to quickly show this just to again highlight how diverse the diet of a white-tailed deer throughout the year can be.
Yeah, and just want to point out that here in Illinois, that browse category is going to be much smaller because
Yes,
that
yes.
browse really that's coming a big time from the northern forest. Like those deer are browsing all the time. That's all they eat is the tender shoots. So that really inflates that graph. Here in Illinois, our deer are probably only browsing on twigs and shoots a very small, maybe 10-20% of the time, and the forbs, mast, and crops, and probably grass takes up the rest of that here.
Absolutely. Good points. And so, well, first off, I kind of mentioned I want to start off with just some groups of plants, and so that's where we're going to start off with first is this term native warm season grasses. And if you're a deer hunter, you've probably heard this. A lot of people use some of these grasses to create bedding areas, to create cover around a food source. And obviously, if you're an upland hunter, this is the kind of stuff you live for. This is the prairie grasses that you're walking through. Well, one thing I want to emphasize really up front is the structural differences between these native warm season grasses like you find in a prairie versus our typical cool season grasses. So a cool season grass are those grasses that are basically in your yard, right? So I think this picture here illustrates it quite well. Just looking at the vertical structure of the grasses. Now, obviously, this bottom picture, it's a manicured lawn, so it's cut nice and short. But imagine that still being a little taller. You're talking maybe 12 inches of seed height for a typical fescue grass. But more importantly, look how it forms this almost even keeled, basically mat-like sod on the ground, where the native warm season grasses are by nature very clump forming. And so as they grow vertically, those tops start to kind of drape over and create nice vertical structure. But again, they're clumping. So at the ground level, it almost creates this maze-like structure that wildlife can kind of navigate throughout. Again, it's very advantageous for our upland birds. That's kind of how they go and find seeds and other insects. But for deer, it is an incredible bedding habitat. So anytime I see prairie on any of the public land sites I hunt, already am making a mental note that, hey, I should probably check that out for bedding because it's very commonly used, particularly a doe bedding. Does very commonly bed in groups, in family groups, maybe 10 to 12 deer in one specific bedding area, where bucks are a lot more solitary. And so oftentimes you'll find does using an area like this just because, again, it's kind of the ideal cover for bedding. One thing I do like to point out too is our native warm season grasses are very drought tolerant. And a lot of that is because look at this root structure on these grasses. And these are actually tied up. You can actually see about halfway up, there's actually a knot in these roots. So these roots get so deep that they have the ability to really pull water up from that deep water table. So in drought years, you may find, if we go back to this graph right up front, you may see that grass percentage grow a little bit more because maybe the mass crop wasn't as strong, and that kind of thing. So they're really good at not only erosion control, but pulling up those nutrients from deep in the soil and kind of providing them up top for wildlife to use. So something I always like to highlight. Now, I'm just going to quickly go through a few of the most common native warm season grasses. Again, there's dozens that are native and commonly found in Illinois, but I'm just going to highlight a few of the ones that are, first of all, very easy to identify, and two, that are very abundant, especially on Illinois public lands. And so this first one is big blue stem. So this is a grass that gets about 4 to 8 feet tall. And the easiest way to, I think personally, to identify this grass is if you look at the very top of it at that seed structure, it almost looks like a little turkey foot at the very top of that seed structure. So that's kind of the definitive giveaway is that, excuse me, that seed head that's shaped like the turkey foot versus some of the other grasses that don't look like that, right? So this would be Indian grass, where that big blue stem has that very nice kind of linear looking turkey foot shape to its seed head. I mentioned Indian grass. This is another very common one that you're going to see on state lands as well as just kind of in ditches. It's a native grass, and it's called Indian grass. If you look at the seed head, I like to think of it almost like a tail or a paintbrush. It just has a different look to it than obviously the big blue stem. So it's pretty easy to identify, but between the two, the leaves are I every time you get into grasses, you start to look at some of the plant identification keys, and it's like, well, this has a slightly bluish gray hue. This one has a bluish green hue. Again, we're not trying to get to that level of detail today, but what I really want to focus on is really just the seed structure between these two. So the big blue stem again has that turkey foot shape, where the Indian foot looks more like a typical grass seed head, where it kind of has this draped feather-like kind of paintbrush look to it. A plant that you're going to see a lot mixed in with native warm season grasses is goldenrod. So this is one of our native herbaceous plants, very common in open and disturbed areas. So it's kind of an early successional species. So if you were to go out and just like nuke your lawn and kill it and leave it as bare soil, chances are the first year it's probably going to have a lot of this goldenrod growing up just naturally. There's a lot of it already in the seed bank. It's already pretty abundant on the landscape. And so a lot of times when I'm out hunting, especially in if we go back to some of these bedding area pictures like this one here in the bottom right, obviously that's in the fall, so you don't have that pretty green and yellow kind of foliage and flowers. But that picture right there, you can see a few clumps of big blue stem kind of right up in the front. And then a lot of that other plant vegetation is going to be this goldenrod. So you'll find it pretty much all over. The flowers are still in bloom as we speak. I was just out last week and even out hunting a little bit this morning and saw plenty of goldenrod still in flower. So it's a common plant you'll see quite a bit. And again, it's very indicative of a bedding area. Now, it is definitely, especially during the late summer before the crops really start producing food, before the mast trees start dropping their acorns and dropping their fruit, it does become a pretty decent food source for deer as they browse on it. And actually, at the workshop last weekend, we found a nice little kind of bedding area that had a feeding area just adjacent to it. And the feeding area was very largely just comprised of some native warm season grass clumps and then a lot of goldenrod. And you could literally walk around and look at the tops of the goldenrod and basically see where they had been bitten off. And so oftentimes when I'm looking for goldenrod, that's what I'm looking for is there active feeding sign on these goldenrods where it looks like something basically came, it just took the top chunk, bit it off, and moved on to the next one. Okay. Computer's froze. Oh, there we go. Now, this is one that's not very good for wildlife, but it's one you see all over. And so we really just wanted to kind of highlight it because we get a lot of questions about it. This is your May apple. It's a perennial plant, so it'll come back year after year after year. And you're typically going to find it in fairly open woodlands that don't have a ton of herbaceous vegetation in the understory. So it really likes a lot of sunlight. But what I do want to emphasize is it's pretty much avoided by most mammals. So there is some toxicity not only in the fruit, but also in the leaves. And so it's kind of a food source that they don't spend too much time feeding on or even thinking about. But again, I want to point it out because you'll see it a lot when you're walking through the woods, especially early fall. Now, this is one of those plants to avoid. This is stinging nettle, and if you've ever come across it, you know why it gets its name. It's very itchy. It's one of these, it's kind of a, let's say a river bottom plant. You'll find it in very wet soils. One of the public areas I hunt, I have a spot that I've kind of coined the buck nest, and I will literally not even go into it this time of year because it's so full of stinging nettle, and that stinging nettle is about up to your waist, and so it's just virtually impossible to walk through there, even wearing good pants and stuff without it getting to you. So keep that in mind. It's fairly common in kind of floodplains or bottomland forests, but it is a really good food source for deer, so they will be in there browsing on it heavily. And again, this is another really good one to look for those tops kind of nibbled off, like I talked about with the goldenrod. You'll see that quite often with stinging nettle, and that's actually how I really kind of identified this one specific feeding area. I was like, man, there's not many oaks. There's not a ton of food around. And the crop fields are still several miles away from this area. What are they feeding on? And so I started walking into the bottom ones, and heck, I found they had literally just every single stinging nettle plant. The top little bit was just nibbled off and eaten off. So they were feeding on those quite readily. And I should say, when you find stinging nettle, it's one of those things you're not just going to find one of, kind of like how I have written here. It often forms in colonies. You're going to see big stands of stinging nettle. So if you ever start walking in an area and you start getting a little itchy, it starts off as itchy and then it starts to get a little tingly and a little stinging towards the end. If you notice that, you may want to back out because you may be walking into stinging nettle. But again, you'll find it very commonly in kind of those bottomland, wetter areas of the forest. Another one that most people are probably familiar with, but since we're talking about plants to avoid, like is the stinging nettle, we're going to talk about poison ivy. So obviously, poison ivy has a chemical that's called urushiol, and a lot of people think it's actually an allergic reaction, but it's not really. But there are people who are unsusceptible to it, so they don't actually get a reaction from that urushiol oil. But good plant to know. And one thing I want to emphasize, especially because this is a deer webinar, right? And this is something growing up I did not know until I started to take, some botany classes and actually learn some things. But if you look at this picture here, Curtis, can you see my cursor as I move it across? If I
Yep.
draw, is that showing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I got the circle.
Perfect. So you see all these aerial roots coming off of this. We have this main vine here, and then we have all these hair-like roots that kind of come off that vine and attach it to the tree. Anytime you see those in Illinois, you can almost guarantee that that's going to be poison ivy. So we're not always just looking for those leaves of three, especially as we get into fall and we start climbing our tree stands. Be on the lookout for these type of vines on the side of the tree, because this part of the poison ivy plant does still contain that urushiol, and so you still can get that same reaction you can get from the leaves just by touching one of the branches or one of these vines as you're climbing up the tree or getting set in your tree stand. So always be on the lookout for those. One thing I do want to kind of mention about, I should have put in a picture of the fruit, but they have fruiting bodies that come off of the poison ivy plant. It's basically a little bundle of berries. It kind of looks like very miniature grapes, but deer really like to eat on poison ivy, whether it's on the vine if they're browsing on it, whether it's on the leaves or whether it's on that fruit. So poison ivy is not all bad. It does make a pretty darn good food source for wildlife. And one thing that I'll kind of quickly mention, it doesn't really matter, but it's a fun factoid. Poison ivy is one of those plants that turns red faster than just about anything else in the woods. And so a lot of times, if you're not really certain on your ID, if it's this time of year, it's probably already starting to develop either a red stem or you're starting to get some reddish tint to these leaves. So that's poison ivy. One of the best decisions I started to make because I'm very susceptible to it. To the point that I swear if my pants touch it and then I put my pants in the washing machine like 2 days later, that's enough to get me the reaction. I started carrying Dawn dish detergent because remember this urushiol, this chemical that's in poison ivy is actually an oil. And so that's what Dawn dish soap is really good is basically cutting through those oils and getting that off you. So I actually carry a little travel size bottle of Dawn dish soap that I keep in my car. So if I'm in an area where I've, felt like I came into contact with poison ivy, I can quickly take a quick, uh, washcloth Dawn shower in the parking lot. So it hopefully catch it before it really starts to get to me. So this is another one. This is Virginia Creeper. Now, luckily, this one is harmless, but I bring it up to show it is very similar looking to poison ivy. You're going to find it pretty much in the exact same areas. It often does turn red early, just like poison ivy does, but you can see it's actually got leaves of 5. And if you were to look closely at this vine structure that's on the tree, it would not have those aerial roots that we kind of talked about with the poison ivy. So it can be confusing, but this is Virginia creeper. It will also not just vine. You will find it growing basically just on the forest floor, like a forest interior plant. So you will see it in cases like that. And again, this is another one that's really great browse. You'll very often find an area where all the leaflets at the top. So this entire structure is called a leaf, and each of these little what most people think are leaves are leaflets. They will basically bite and remove that whole thing and eat on it. So you'll find a lot of areas where you'll just find little stems sticking up, and it was probably Virginia creeper that they were out there chowing down on. So here's another vining that makes great browse. Now I want to quickly clarify I think I remember looking, there's like 35 different species of green briar just in Illinois alone. So I'm not going into the level of detail for that. They pretty much all look relatively similar. Some of them have a lot more spiky bits, some of them have a lot less spiky bits, some have more spiky bits on the leaves, some don't, but they all have this very dark, glossy, and almost thick leaves. So if you picked up a maple leaf, they're fairly paper thin, right? If you were to pick up a greenbrier leaf, they're going to be a little bit thicker, and it's going to actually feel like it has some real structure to it. Now, this is a vine that you're going to find pretty much everywhere. It's another one that really likes disturbance. So anytime you are in an area that has been actively cleared, or maybe a big tree fell down, or the forest opened up in some aspect, you're going to find greenbrier. It's one of those early successional species that'll move into these disturbed areas pretty quick. And so you're often going to find it a lot in open areas and on the edges of open areas. But I say that to say some of those species, like I mentioned, there's a lot of them, can also be woodland interior. So you're also going to be able to find this stuff deep inside of the woods. Very uncomfortable to walk through. Obviously, we've probably all walked through it at one point or another, but it's a highly, highly preferred woody browse for deer. And you will kind of like I mentioned with the goldenrod, the Virginia creeper, and even the poison ivy. This is one that just about every time I find a decent sized stand of greenbrier in an area where I expect deer to be, you're going to see that those new growth is what they're really targeting. So if you're unfamiliar with how a plant grows, essentially it's going to have nodes along the stem. And as it starts to regrow out that new shoot, that's going to have a lot more nutrients in it. And so oftentimes when we talk about browsing, that's what the deer are really focused on. They're not necessarily focused on this big dry hunk of stem. They're focused on that new tender growth that has a lot of the nutrients that they're looking for. And so oftentimes you'll find those nibbled off, particularly on greenbrier. All right, so this is kind of our first one that is unfortunately a non-native, but it's something you're going to see just about everywhere. Again, another early successional species. Now, when I say early successional, you'll start to pick up on a theme. Deer are what we would consider, especially when we're viewing their cover habitat, they are very much an early successional species. And what I mean by early successional, if you were to, let's go back a few slides because I think it's probably important to identify this term. If we were to just take your grass lawn and just let it grow and just not touch it, not mow it, not treat it, not spray it, not burn it, nothing, it will go through this natural succession phase where it's going to go from grass to your taller grass. Then after that, it will probably start to move into more of this type of look, this old fallow field with more of the goldenrod starting to move into it. You'll start to get poison ivy, Virginia creeper, greenbrier, multiflora rose, and then it's going to start transitioning to a forest. And so you can almost view it as grassland to shrubs, from shrubs to short forest to mature forest. And deer, in terms of cover, really like the early portions of that succession. So if you think about all the cover habitat, anytime you jump a deer out of its bed, it's probably in areas that have what we consider a high stem count. So there's a lot of individual plants in that one specific area, making it thick cover, right? And so a lot of what you'll see throughout this presentation is us identifying these early successional plants because that's where deer are oftentimes going to be, and multiflora rose is no exception to that. This is again an exotic that was brought over from Asia. I believe the original intention was to use it as erosion control, and it just really started to thrive in our landscape and has basically become naturalized to the point that there are very few public spaces that I've personally been to that don't have multiflora rose. Now, we do have a native rose species. I didn't necessarily put it in this presentation. If you happen to care, they look very similar. The only distinct difference between our native rose and this multiflora rose is this structure here, we call it the stipular. And as you can see, it's kind of frayed, right? And so there's all these little hair-like projections coming off that. I'll clear that image so you can see it again quite clearly. You can kind of see these frayed edges. You can see it really good in this graphic up here that they drew because they're trying to highlight that. Our native rose species do not have those. So you will not find they will be one solid leaf-looking structure at that node rather than kind of these hair-like projections that stick off there. So again, uh, uh, something you're going to find everywhere. Common plant. It does have thorns, so be careful walking through it. But again, it's a really great cover plant as well as they will use it for browse. Bush honeysuckle. This is yet again another what I would consider early successional species. However, it gets to the point that it dominates a lot of mature forests. And one of the reasons why is it has this ability, what we call allelopathy. And we have a few other plant species that I'll bring up a little bit later that also have this same capability. And essentially what it does is it secretes a toxin from its root system. And so it does that to basically encroach and basically remove all the competition, right? So all the plants in an area are trying to compete for the same nutrients, the same water. Well, a plant like bush honeysuckle secretes a toxin that basically nukes everything else around it, and so it can become the dominant plant very, very quickly in an area. And so this is a plant you're going to see everywhere. I was at Kankakee River State Park a year or two ago, deer hunting, just trying a new area, and it honestly feels like you're not even in Illinois in some of these parts where the bush honeysuckle is so mature and so dominant. There's literally nothing but bush honeysuckle. The ground is completely dirt. There's no other plant life even trying to sprout. It's pretty gross looking, but it's definitely something to keep in mind to know. And deer will use it for bedding cover because, as you can see in this bottom picture, when it starts to grow, it will really take over an area and just become the dominant plant. And it kind of forms a similar structure to the native warm season grasses where you have this vertical overarching structure above and it kind of creates this maze-like structure on the ground level. It does kind of produce that same effect. Obviously, we'd much rather be native plants in that area than bush honeysuckle, but keep that in mind. You will find deer using a lot of bush honeysuckle thickets as bedding cover. Now, you'll notice these beautiful red berries. Unfortunately, let me go back. Unfortunately, most wildlife species, deer included, do not like them and will basically actively avoid them. So there was a study by the excuse me, by the Georgia Deer Lab a few years ago they basically looked at the caloric content of these specific berries, and basically their findings indicated that it takes more energy to for an animal to digest this berry than it actually gets from digesting the berry. So it's kind of a net negative from eating the berry, and so you won't find many wildlife eating them. Birds will even actively avoid it. But I bring it up to say you will see red berries. They're still bearing right now. When we were out at Des Plaines State Fish and Wildlife Area last weekend, we still saw plenty of bush honeysuckle with tons of berries still all over it. And so it will be one of the first plants to green up in the spring, and it will be one of the last plant species to basically go into dormancy in the fall. So if you're ever just driving down the interstate and you just nothing is green yet, but you just see green shrubs all everywhere, that's bush honeysuckle. Provides very minimal wildlife benefit, but you're going to see it everywhere. And again, does create some interesting cover structure for whitetail deer. Anything to add on bush honeysuckle, Curtis? I know you've got it all over your area too.
No, I mean, just it really stands out, I think, early in the year too, and it's like the
Yeah.
first thing that really starts popping. And anytime you see an area that's like all uniformly the same thing, it's a safe bet to assume it's probably a non-native, it's probably an invasive, because most of our native plants are made to like be diverse, and that's what wildlife really wants is diversity, not a monoculture. So no, but yeah, grapevine. This is a good one. I love that. It's such a cool looking leaf on the grapes.
It is. It is. And there, again, this is kind of like Greenbrier. There's probably a dozen different grape. There's fox grape, there's summer grape, there's all these different grape species, but we're just kind of lumping them all together for this topic. And again, most people are probably familiar if you're just walking through the woods and you see these Tarzan-like thick vines that you want to just let out your inner child and swing from. Those are going to be your grapevines. But pay attention to the leaf structure too, because this is again another one of those that is very fond of disturbed areas. And so it's again one of these early successionals that when a new forest opening opens or something like that, you're going to see grapevine moving in there pretty quickly. It obviously won't be this mature structure that you often find in the interior of the forest where it's growing up large on these trees. It'll look more like kind of just a clump of these type of leaves on the ground. But pay attention to those because they will feed on them quite readily as browse. And then obviously when they're fruiting, definitely. Now, this is one of my favorite plants. This is common blackberry. And again, just like all the other ones, there's a plethora of different species we don't need to go into. I just want you to be able to know what a blackberry looks like for several different reasons. One, I have found, and Curtis, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Again, this is all anecdotal. The vast majority of times that I jump does out of a grassland bedding area, again, anecdotally, it seems like the vast majority of the time they're in a little pocket of blackberries that are inside that prairie. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think something that provides them some level of protection. Same with people, right? They go up in the desert and they put a fence around or put a moat around or whatever it might be. And I think deer are the same way. So having a little something around you, a structure that might prevent creepy critters like coyotes and bobcats from sneaking up right behind you, that's probably has a benefit to that. I definitely feel it like we see it much more with buck beds, because
Oh,
they
for
choose
sure. Yeah.
their bedding much more carefully, usually in the woods, not in the grasslands, and they've almost always got something hard or impenetrable that they can get back against so that they've only got to monitor maybe 180 degrees instead of 360. But yeah, I definitely feel like I've seen that with deer, especially once we get into when it's pressured.
Yeah.
This time of year before pressures build up, I feel like they're more looking for shade, and so that might be the determining factor. Where in the grass field can they find some shade, especially when it's 80 degrees plus. But yeah, they know, they already know we're 9 days into the season. So yeah, they've known now for 8.5 days now that season is on. So they're starting to definitely employ little things like that that just give them a little bit of an edge.
Yep. And obviously this is a deer webinar, but I want to just quickly go on a quick tangent here. If you're a pheasant or quail or even rabbit hunter and you're walking through a prairie, I've seen it so many times, and I'm certainly guilty of it too. A lot of times we as hunters try to take the path of least resistance. Well, nine times out of 10, especially upland birds, they are very, very heavily going to be focused in these woody growth areas. So if you're out rabbit hunting, pheasant hunting, quail hunting, anytime I'm walking through a prairie and I see basically a blackberry thicket that may be, oftentimes they may be 20 feet in circumference, they're not huge. I'm going to make special emphasis to actually either A, send a dog through there, or B, push it myself. Again, a lot of people try to avoid them just because, again, it's not fun to walk through if you're not wearing the proper pants or, scrape up your hands. But a lot of times that's where the birds are going to be centered for basically the exact same reason Curtis just kind of described with deer. Just gives them a little bit more different vertical cover and structure and protection than the rest of the prairie is providing.
Yeah, not to mention a good food source as well. A lot of people will call blackberry just bramble. They'll call it bramble to mean blackberry or raspberry or anything like that. And yeah, rabbit hunters always love that stuff. Your bird hunters love that stuff. And hey, deer too. And us
I
humans
was just
too.
about to say my wife loves it too.
Yeah, we're getting late in the year now, but when you're in the peak of summer, I mean, blackberries are not quite my favorite. So blackberries are good. They're the ones when you pick them off like these here, and then they're just flat. But when you find the black raspberries, or in Wisconsin they call them black caps, those are the ones you pick off and they're hollow. Oh, now those are
Yeah.
like the filet mignon of found berries in the Midwestern forest edge. Oh, yeah, black raspberries. If you find those, pick every one you can because they're good.
And it's a great excuse to go out and get some kind of late summer scouting. One of the areas I hunt, I basically walk along it's like an old logging road that I'm walking along a giant prairie. On one side I have basically it's probably a 15-year-old tree plantation at this time, so it's starting to mature, but there are just blackberries galore and raspberries galore in there. So every July and August I make a special point to go out that specific property to, I have air quotes here, to scout, but really I'm going out to pick some berries. So
Yeah, they freeze well.
that they do. They freeze very well.
They don't last in your fridge very long, but just keep some of them for snacking, and then you can freeze them in bags and pull them out to add into your pancakes or any kind of desserts you're making, or just into cereal. I mean, they're just as good as your store bought raspberries and blueberries, and you can go out there and collect them organic for free
Yep.
if you
And there's
want to do
something
that.
about we call it field heat. I say the same thing with my garden too. When you grab a tomato off the vine, it's still got that heat from the sun, and it tastes so much better. The vast majority of the time I'm picking these blackberries, I probably only take home a third of what I picked because I'm just sitting there munching the whole time because they're that darn good. But all right, moving right along. This is another what I call a wicked plant. And this is one that growing up I saw the weird fruit from it, and I never really saw wildlife doing anything with it. You would just find like a big pile of the giant seed pods that you can kind of see here in this picture. They're this long, brown, spindly looking legume bean, basically, and they can be 18 inches. I mean, we're talking a big bean pod. But what I've started noticing, particularly in the later portion of the season, as a lot of these other food sources start to wind down, right? Your crops are gone. The mast from the acorns has already either A, been consumed or starting to rot. And obviously at this time, dormancy is a thing. So there's not a ton of that fresh, kind of tender browse that we were talking about. That's when I start to, in my head, make mental notes of where I've seen honey locust on my hunting areas, because I have noticed that in that late winter when food becomes a little scarce, you will find deer actively feeding on these. And again, it's not a preferred food source, but if that's all that's out there, they will readily consume it. So this is a plant you're going to see, or a tree you're going to see everywhere. Again, not native. It was brought over. You will even see it in parks. There was a park I grew up or went to school in Kentucky, and there was a park there that they decided to plant all like hundreds of these things, right? And then they put in a bike path that went right next to him, and all it did was pop everybody's tires. So they went through and cut all those down, and now there's actually specific cultivars that are designed to be spineless, so they don't have any of these big spines. But you will see them used kind of horticulturally as well. But anytime you see these spines, it's a dead giveaway, honey locust.
Hmm. Sounds like that designer didn't like cyclists.
That's one way to get them off the road, I guess.
But yeah, I did read one report of a past famous bow hunter. I can't remember his name, but he would actually in the late season, when would get a blizzard or something like that, where the deer would get hungry, he would seek out those locust
I
pods and
believe
just
it.
would
Yeah.
hunt over it like a food source, like if it was an apple orchard or something like that. And he had one report where he had 5 bucks in one snowstorm that came into this locust tree just for those pods.
And I moved forward a little bit. We'll go back. I have noticed just because we're having this conversation, I have noticed the exact same trend with these Osage orange or hedge apples. It's something that one of the areas I hunt, I mean, the entire bottomland is just covered in these trees. And I never saw deer feeding on them until we had a big snow event. I was like, all right, I'm going to go after the snow event, see what they're, because then I can actually see what they're feeding on. I can follow these tracks, know, hey, these tracks are made this morning. I know I'm getting up to date information. And I literally saw piles where they had just been gnawing. They'll take like one or two bites out of each and then move on to another one. But again, that was very late winter. Food was probably pretty scarce on the landscape, and that's when I noticed they were really focused on the honey locust pods as well as these big Osage orange. Which, if you have kids, they make great softballs. They're fun to kind of hit with a baseball bat. But yeah, so just kind of wanted to get on that tangent since we were talking about some kind of late winter food stuff. But now I want to dive into oaks a little bit. Again, there is dozens and dozens and if not hundreds of oak species in Illinois. I'm going to talk about a few distinct species, but more importantly, I just want to talk about oaks in general. And so when we talk about mast crops, particularly for deer in Illinois, we're really talking about oaks. Um, Obviously, we have other mast producing trees, hard mast, so that can be your hickories, your black walnuts. We have the soft mast, which is all your fruit. But in general, when we're talking, when you just hear people say, "Oh yeah, we had a good mast crop this year," if they're a deer hunter, 9 times out of 10, they're talking about those specific oaks and those acorns. But I want to break it down really quick into two specific groups. And if you've taken our webinars before, you've probably heard this, so bear with me. But we have two distinct groups of oaks. Each has, again, dozens and dozens of species. We have the red oak group and we have the white oak group. Now, important thing to know, white oak is basically the preferred acorn for the vast majority of wildlife species. It has a lower amount of tannic acid content, which makes it a much sweeter. It's not as bitter as the red oaks who have a higher tannic acid content. Those are going to often taste bitter. So the white oaks are going to be that preferred acorn, which means they are generally consumed first. And since they don't have that higher tannin content or that tannic acid, they tend to rot on the forest floor pretty quick, either germinate or rot. And so that's where you will naturally see a shift. And I don't want to put a time frame on it because it seems to be different every year. But I have spots where I will see deer every single sit feeding in a white oak flat. And then all of a sudden it's like a light switch flipped and they're just gone. I'm like, what in the heck? I know they didn't bust me. My wind's right, everything. And I'll sit there for 2 or 3 more days. Nothing, nothing. Chances are they're moving to a stand that has more red oaks because at that point they've probably cleared out a lot of the food in that specific area. And so you'll naturally see them shift from that white oak feeding area to a red oak feeding area. One other big benefit to the red oak, not only again do they last a lot longer on the ground, so they act as like that nice secondary food source, but it takes two individual growing seasons, so 2 springs and summers, to produce an individual acorn on a red oak. Now, a red oak is still producing acorns every single year, but each individual acorn, it takes 2 years to grow. And so that means it's a little bit more tolerant of weather conditions, right? So if you have a really bad growing season where you just don't get a lot of precipitation, you have severe drought, it may really impact your white oak crop to the point that you just don't have a very good production of white oak acorns. But you have that buffer crop of the red oak, which those acorns, remember, some of those acorns already had at least one good growing season, and so they're still going to be producing acorns at a pretty sufficient level. And so I'm also thinking about that as I'm looking. Now this year, it seems like I was out in the woods this morning and acorns were freaking everywhere, whether it was white or red. It seems like it was a pretty good mass crop this year, but keep that in mind for other years, definitely. Now, how do you tell the difference? Luckily, it's pretty easy. The nice thing about oaks is they have a very what a lot of people term hardy leaf. And so what I mean by that is if you look at your maple trees or some of the other trees, they're going to lose all of their leaves when they lose leaves, and they lose them pretty quickly. Oaks tend to always contain some amount of leaves on the tree. Now, they're going to be brown, they're going to be hard to reach because they're probably going to be up. But with a pair of binoculars, you can still pretty clearly see that definitive mark. And what we're looking for is these hair like projections. We call them bristle tips, basically coming off the tips of the lobes. That indicates a red oak. Here we have a white oak leaf. See how we have these beautiful rounded lobes? And what is it missing? It does not have that little bristle tip. So boom, that's your instant ID characteristic. Is it a red oak versus a white oak? Now there's obviously a lot more to it, but that will give you that perfect breakdown when you're out in the field between those two. So white oaks, we kind of went over a lot of this already. One thing I do want to talk about, and I don't think I have a very good picture of it. I unfortunately don't. The bark characteristics of white oak. I almost call white oak what I call a 60 mile per hour tree. And so it's one of these trees that as you start to identify it, you can see it along the side of the road as you're going 60 miles an hour because it's that distinct and that descript. And what we're looking for, again, I should have put a picture. I can't believe I didn't, is it has a very platy bark. I'm going to move forward to shagbark hickory. So it has this appearance on the bark, but it only has that appearance towards the upper portions of the tree. As that tree gets bigger and more mature towards the base, it will lose a lot of this kind of platy bark characteristic and be more of a your typical smooth barked looking tree. But if you were to look up, you would still see a lot of that platy bark. And I want to say that just because it's a really cool tree that I think a lot of people just think, oh yeah, it's our native oak, it's everywhere, but it's really good. Not only for deer, for turkey, squirrels, but even bats. So our native bat species, due to the nature of that platy bark, will actually get underneath it, and that's oftentimes where they will sleep is inside that white oak bark. So just a fun little factoid there. But this is again, if you're looking for deer feeding areas in the woods throughout fall, learn to ID this white oak, and it will serve you very well. So this is a pin oak. Now, if you think back to our little description a few minutes ago, you got these pointy lobes with bristle tips. Boom, red oak. Instantly know that right up front. Now, the reason I like to talk about a pin oak is due to the acorn size, and you will find other species of wildlife that you may not even expect to be acorn feeders up in areas feeding on acorns. There's a spot out at St. Chris Lake State Fish and Wildlife Area where it's this pretty significant ridge that overlooks into their big waterfowl, one of their waterfowl wetland units. And on top of that ridge is just lined with nothing but these giant pin oaks. And they have about a perfect size acorn that you will oftentimes see wood ducks up in the forest feeding on those acorns because it's the perfect size for them. So a lot of things feed on acorns, but this is a pin oak. You probably will see this very commonly in people's yards. It's a very ornamental native tree. The easiest way to ID a pin oak is it's going to have a ton of leaves or a ton of limbs that come off horizontally, and they're all going to be fairly small. They're not, it's not going to have these big giant limbs that make great, turkey roosting areas. It's going to be these very spindly, and oftentimes you'll see a lot of dead limbs on these just because they're very thin and very fragile and very susceptible to wind damage. Shingle oak. So I want to bring this up because so many people think, oh, well, an oak has to look like these two leaves, right? Not really. We have some weird looking oak species. So this is called shingle oak. And if you look at it, it basically looks like just your standard oval shaped leaf. Not too descript. Again, another common one in Illinois. You're going to see it in a variety of different habitats. So just keep in mind, just because you don't see those typical lobe-like structures, that doesn't mean it's not an oak. So a lot of times, if you're just getting to the point you're still trying to ID a lot of oaks, look for these clusters of acorns. That's kind of obviously your dead giveaway. Now, it's hard to see in these pictures, but you still would see that bristle tip present on the tip of this leaf. So just because it doesn't have all those lobes at the very tip, if it was a red oak, it will still have that bristle tip, and if it's a white oak species, it will not. All right, so this is a cool tree. This is arguably one of our most, in terms of economic value, probably our most valuable tree in Illinois and across a lot of the Midwest. In all reality, makes great furniture. Um, This is, I talked about the allelopathy with the bush honeysuckle and how it basically secretes these toxins from the roots and basically outcompetes everything else and just forces everything else to die in the area. Black walnuts are the same. And if you need proof of it, my neighbor has one that's growing basically right on our fence line. And I have struggled for years to try to get this patch of grass that's probably 15-foot diameter around that tree to grow, and I can't get anything to grow there. And it's just again because of that allelopathy. So this is black walnut. Deer will browse on new growth. They are not really going to focus on these fruiting structures, so on the nut or the husks itself. Doesn't make for great food for deer. Squirrels love it, and if you're into trapping, I'll let Curtis take it away if he's here, but he probably knows where I'm going with this. But a lot of people actually use the tannin because these fruits are so high in tannin acid and tannin that you can actually use it to dye things.
Yeah, I mean beyond just trapping, but yeah, I think that's been used as a black dye for ages. You just collect all those walnuts, throw them in a tub of water, and then anything you soak in that water for a period is gonna absorb that black dye. So that could be traps if you're trying to dye them, make them a little more camouflaged, or I mean, I've heard of people doing it with wood to give wood a nice dark stain, natural stain, a lot of different things.
Yeah. So again, this is one you'll see a lot in Illinois. And if you're unfamiliar with trees, you may look at that and go, "Oh, deer probably eat on that," but in reality, they won't. Again, if there's a lot of young growth, so this whole structure down here, this is your leaf. All these individual things are called leaflets. This entire structure is one leaf. And so oftentimes when it's a very, young sapling plant, they'll come off and just grab an entire and basically bite right here and just take a few of the leaflets, eat it, and move on. But that's about all they're going to specifically use for it. But again, wanted to highlight it because you're going to see it a lot. And a lot of people wonder. Again, makes for great squirrel, especially in kind of late August.
Yeah, and as for human food, humans
Oh
can
yeah.
eat black walnuts, but you have to there's like a whole process to remove those tannins so that they're not so bitter. Most of the walnuts that you would pick up in the store are going to be English walnuts, and they naturally don't have nearly the level of that really bitter tannin stuff that the black walnut has. So it can be done, but don't think you're just going to collect them, crack them open, and eat them and have a tasty snack. It's not quite going to be that easy.
I did it the first year we moved into this house. It was just, I mean, raining. And of course, the dogs are picking them up, and then they're not great for dogs. So don't let your dogs eat them. So we literally walked around and just filled, I think we had 6 or 7 5-gallon buckets full of things. It's like, oh, I'm going to start cracking. And then I started reading into the process. I was like, okay, I'm not going to do that. It's a lot of work. All right, another plant that kind of goes right alongside the walnuts is the shagbark hickory. So again, we have quite a few different hickory species in Illinois, but this is definitely one of the ones that you're most likely to come across fairly regularly. The bark is pretty much the dead giveaway here, and so it's this real platy bark that basically goes all the way down to the trunk. So it's going to look like this the entire tree, all the way up to the top and all the way up to the all the way down to the bottom. Makes again great bat nesting habitat, and some other in southern Illinois where you have a little bit more reptile and amphibian populations. You'll see corn snakes and some other species getting underneath these as well and using them as cover. But something you're going to come across a lot, so definitely know what it is. The nut structure itself is going to be these big husks, and again, we have several different species, and you can ID them based on the nut itself, and a lot of it is how thick is the husk that surrounds the nut that's inside it. But as a hunter, doesn't matter a whole lot. Just know that this is your hickory. Again, not too important for us as deer hunters, other than they will feed on kind of that new growth. But the reason I wanted to bring up the hickories in general in this specific webinar is they tend to reproduce very regularly. And so oftentimes if you find an area where you're seeing a few shagbark hickories that look mature, a lot of times the understory is going to be full of little young hickory saplings. And again, the deer are going to be in there browsing on them. They can also use them as cover, but that's hickory. So great plant, great tree. If you're a squirrel hunter, definitely learn to ID all your hickories.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up. Super important for squirrel hunters. And I think one of the big reasons why deer don't eat them more than they do is just because they're gone before deer season. Because squirrels really will, like, they're gone.
They're
If
gone.
you go
Yeah.
out and look right now, you will not find any hickory nuts left almost across all the landscape because the squirrels have basically eaten them all. And not just shagbark, but we also got the mocker nut hickory.
Mocker
These
nut. Yep.
these are
Red
related
hickory.
to pecans. So these nuts are a lot better than like black walnuts. They don't have that bitter taste. These are preferred. They're easy to crack open, and for a probably a 2 week period, and it's usually in probably in like early September, even starting in late August. Squirrel hunting can be the best it's going to be all year if you can find a good stand of hickories. That's going to be the dinner bell that's going to bring those squirrels in from hundreds of acres all around. They'll be flocking to those trees. So note that for your squirrel hunts. Good
Absolutely. I
old
mean, and just to put it in
persimmon.
perspective, I was out, or a few of us were out. It was probably the first weekend in September, trying to basically get that exact feeding activity that Curtis was just talking about, hunting squirrels. And literally, I was sitting in an area that probably had 4 or 5 really nice sized hickory trees, all in our basically right under us or above us. And we just sat there, and it was literally raining hickory nut particles down on us as multiple squirrels were just up there and cutting and just trying to open these nuts and start eating on them. It was literally just raining down hickory nut particles. So again, it like Curtis said, it's a lot of fun, but it is a fairly short window, so it's only a few weeks there. But yeah, we definitely experienced it in kind of that first weekend in September for sure. All right, another group of trees, and again, I'm not covering every different maple species because there's a ton of them, but this is red maple. The deer definitely love to browse on the saplings and on stump sprouts, especially. So maple, they have a real tendency to do this to where if you were to cut down a red maple in your front yard and just leave it, chances are it would start to sprout again, right? It would either sprout from the old roots or from that old trunk itself. And so a lot of times, if you're actually trying to remove a maple and you have to put some herbicide or get in there and actually, cut up that cambium layer and really kill the tree, because they're so prominent at doing what we call stump sprouting to the point that it almost becomes a really good food source because it does that so well. And so oftentimes you'll find, again, this is one of our tree species that I would consider more early successional than a lot of others. If you're in an area that's just starting to get to that stage where the forest is starting to retake those fields, oftentimes these are kind of the first tree species that you're going to see. They're very early successional, and a lot of it is due to the seed structure. And so we've probably all seen these. These are called chimeras. So it's a winged individual seed. So the seed head is down here, and that wing structure just allows them to disperse quite a bit. So great food source for birds and other kind of small mammals. Not deer. They're really not going to focus on these seeds, but again, they will focus on that new growth and those new tender shoots quite regularly. And our maples, we have maples that can grow in water, and we have maples that can grow in the driest of conditions. So they're very much a tree that can grow just about anywhere. Persimmon. How about you take this one away, Curtis? I know you like the persimmons.
Yeah, I actually was almost thinking about going and trying to collect some today because I remembered that last year I was scouting an area and found a whole bunch of persimmons trees where I set up a camera, and I was like, huh, I should go and just collect
Yeah.
like a big old baggie of those persimmons. But anyway, yeah, this is a tree that's really associated with disturbance. So a lot of times you'll find these along old forest roads or along a field edge. And if you can find them, when these fruits are ripe, I mean it's the same kind of appeal as an apple orchard or even a corn feeder down in Texas. This is like the dinner bell ringing, and not just for deer. I mean, you're talking possums, raccoons, foxes. There's a whole lot of animals that like to eat really sweet fruit. And here in the Midwest, we don't have that many sweet fruits that we can just find out there in the wild that are like substantial mass wise. Really, there's only two that I can think of: persimmons and pawpaw. And pawpaw, like, good luck finding those. I've in my whole life, as far as ripe pawpaw fruits, I've only found a single digit number, but persimmons, you can find them every single year, so much more reliable. It is a tree where there's male and females, and so only the females produce fruits. So if you do have a tree that you notice, every year there's no fruit, well, there might be a male. It's never going to have a fruit. But when you find these, it's got an interesting, and I don't know the technical name for it. I should have looked it up. But if you bite into a persimmons before it's ripe, it's if you've ever seen the movie Me, Myself, and Irene, where Jim Carrey's face almost eats himself because he's got such bad cotton mouth. I think he was riding his motorcycle and he got really bad cotton mouth. Well, anyway, that's what it'll do to you. You take one bite and all of a sudden you've got the worst cotton mouth you've ever had in your life. That's an underripe one, but you find a nice orange, juicy one that's ripe, and it really is a tasty fruit. It's hard to even
They're so
compare.
sweet. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to compare to anything because I want to say like a clementine, but it's not the same consistency or structure as a citrus fruit. So it's more like just it's more like a berry,
Yeah.
a congealed mass of like just sweet, fruity paste. But they really are good. It's got a good, unique flavor. They don't hold up well, which is why you don't see them for sale in any of your local grocery stores. Sometimes you'll see a more hardy version, a Asian persimmons for sale, but it's a little bit different than our native. But my biggest way that I pick them out is their bark looks like alligator skin. So it's a real dark bark. We didn't get a good picture of it here, but it really looks like alligator skin, and that's usually what sticks out to me first. And then you start looking up and you see all those fruits, and hey, you might have a spot to hang a stand, or if nothing else, collect some of those ripe ones and give them a try. Maybe bring some home and mix them into your lemonade or your ice cream, and have a little delectable Midwestern treat that not too many people have gotten to try.
And they are, I just want to emphasize not only how tasty they are, but how preferred they are. I swear deer eat them before they even hit the ground. It's like they're falling off the tree and they just fall straight into a deer's mouth. I mean, it's pretty crazy. But I wanted to bring in a picture really quick just to show the bark. So give me a second here, just because again, it really is that distinct that we kind of have to show it.
Sure, yeah, really alligator skin, just that dark bark. Dan will find a picture here soon, but and then pawpaws, we didn't include them here because this fruit is not. It's always gone by the time deer season's here, so it's not an important deer fruit. But just since I brought it up, that's our other kind of substantial, yummy fruit that you can find here in Illinois and across the Midwest, and even tougher to find than persimmons, but really tasty. People call it the Midwestern banana. There's that beautiful bark. Look at that. It looks just like an alligator there.
And there's nothing else that looks like that bark. It's again one of those 60-mile-per-hour trees that once you develop that search image, you'll never misidentify a persimmon.
Yeah, if you shrink it down, you'd have to shrink it down, scale it down several orders of magnitude. But what is it? It's like a lot of times dogwood bark will look like that, just like
Yeah, that's
tiny,
fair. Yep.
but scaled way down. Obviously, not that big, chunky alligator bark there.
Awesome. All right. So moving right along, I kind of touched on this one a little bit when we were talking about, those late winter food sources like honey locust. That's when I've also seen some activity shifting over towards eating these Osage orange trees. You'll find them quite regularly on state land. Now, it's definitely not a huge wildlife benefit tree to the point that you'll see a lot of state land actually removing Osage orange. And so one of the areas I hunt, they do a lot of girdling, which basically means they take a chainsaw and do a circle around the tree, just enough to basically kill it. And so it'll still be a standing structure, but the tree itself is dead and it's not going to be producing the fruit. And so you'll see that a lot. So I just want to bring that up. But again, pretty easy to identify because you'll see these food things everywhere. These giant, some people call them monkey brains, but they're about softball sized. And again, I really only see deer feeding on them really when there's not a ton of food left on the landscape and they're kind of in that really late winter dire straits period where they're just trying to eat whatever they can and put on as much weight and fat before real winter hits. But the wood itself, which is kind of why I like to talk about it. Obviously, we're big on archery here. We talk about that and push that hard at a lot of our events just because of the amount of opportunity and access that you have compared to firearm. But historically, a lot of our traditional archery equipment was made using Osage orange trees, and there's actually a lot of furniture makers that are still using Osage orange because it has the ability to be very bendy without actually snapping and breaking. So it's a very forgiving wood, very cool. It's got a very pretty orange color to it. But again, this is Osage orange.
Yeah, same with rabbits and squirrels. They're only going to eat these when times get it the hardest, and I almost think they might be eating it for water content as much as anything else, like a
There's probably some
starvation.
truth to that. Yep.
I don't think they taste very good, but yeah, and also highly used. I worked in the agricultural construction trade for like a decade when I was in high school and college, and when you make fence posts in the Midwest, you make them with Osage orange if you can, and all of the wooden hardware that basically is associated with fences, if that's not something that's treated, it's going to be Osage orange because the Osage orange will actually outlast the treated stuff. You could buy high dollar penetrated lumber and put it side by side with Osage orange, and the Osage orange will outlast it. I've seen fences that are 100 years old made out of primarily Osage orange that are still like, what do they say? Horse high, pig tight, or
Yeah,
no,
yeah,
bull
yeah.
strong, pig tight, horse high. So really useful wood, but it is a hard wood to work with. It is so dense. If you're used to chainsawing up your normal hardwoods, you're gonna have a fit with Osage orange because it's like oak on steroids.
And I should bring up just since we're still talking about it before I move on. One reason I put it in this PowerPoint obviously to again talk about very late winter foods, but I have found a lot of, and again maybe it's just one of the areas that I hunt. It's a bottomland. I told you earlier this was when we were talking about stinging nettle. This is that same place. And so imagine this big Osage orange tree and imagine a couple hundred of them all just in a forest together, and the understory is nothing but stinging nettle. And for some reason on this specific property, the whole property it's fairly small. It's public, and so there's only like 20% of it is forest, the rest is prairie. But what I have found is the vast majority of deer are bedding in this Osage orange stinging nettle kind of habitat. I don't know if it's just because it's further away from all the parking lots, further away from the road, doesn't get a ton of pressure, that kind of thing. But I have noticed very commonly, especially in that later portion of the year, deer really tend to flock to those areas in bed. And I think it just gives a really nice, good cover, as well as, like we talked about, that really late season kind of crappy food source. But if it's there and that's the only thing around, they're going to eat it. All right, another one that most people are probably familiar with, so we won't spend too much time here, but this is our Eastern red cedar. This is a very common tree. Again, really likes disturbed areas. It typically likes poor soil, and so it's an acidic plant. So not only does it prefer more acidic soils, but it also turns the soil a little bit more acidic. So oftentimes when you find one, you're usually not going to find just one cedar tree. You're normally going to find what we call a cedar thicket. And those are fantastic bedding areas. I like to always pretty much identify those right up front. Now, I think they get talked about a little, like a lot of people focus on just cedar bedding and they think deer are only going to bed in cedars. The real times that I personally like to focus on cedar bedding are those either very cold and windy days, or if you have some precipitation event, whether it's snow, whether it's rain, that's when I seem to find a lot of active bedding occurring in cedar thickets. Because just look at the structure of this, right? I mean, if you were to take a hose and put it at the top, there's not a lot of water that's getting through all that. And especially if everything else, right, these are not, they're not going to lose their leaves. They're going to stay evergreen. And so it just gives that really nice winter cover. So I am always looking for cedar thickets. And one of the easiest ways I have found to do so is to go to any of your mapping software, whether it's HuntStand, Onyx. I personally use Google Earth for it because it's free and it works just fine. But you can go back in Google Earth and look at satellite imagery, the historical satellite imagery, because a lot of times when we look at satellite imagery, it's beautiful green, everything's nice and lush, and you can't really tell any distinct differences between any of the vegetation. But if you go back in time, you will eventually find a satellite image that was taken during leaf off, right? And so that everything's going to just look like this barren wasteland. And then you're going to see these little pockets of green. And that green is going to be your evergreens. And chances are in Illinois, we do have some pines, but our primary evergreen that you're going to see in the landscape is going to be these cedars. So anytime I get to a new site, that's one of the first things I do is go back in time on those aerial maps, see if I can identify where some of the cedar thickets are, and just keep that in my mind. Again, I might not go hunt it right away. I might use it later on, but it's good information to know, especially on those cold, frigid, windy days, because it blocks a lot of wind and it can block a lot of precipitation.
Yeah, and a
It,
couple other quick
yep.
uses that are of interest of hunters. One is cover scent. Red cedar is a great cover scent. If you find a couple big red cedars, like in that picture there in the bottom, just get all your hunting clothes on and just go get all nuzzled up in there like you're a cat, and just rub those boughs all up over you, and your whole body will smell like red cedar, and it's a good smell. And guess what? It is a little bit of a cover scent. Does that mean that you don't have to worry about the wind when you're deer hunting? Absolutely not. But does it help a little? Probably.
Every
If nothing
percent
else,
adds up. Yep.
makes you smell a little bit better. But
It keeps the
the
moths away at least. So there you go.
Hey, sure, yeah. If you got a big moth problem, usually it's mosquitoes around that, but whatever. But another use is the berries there. You can see them, and they're not real berries. They're actually, so red cedar is another tree that's got boy and girl trees, and so the female trees will grow these little. They're called juniper berries. Those little blue
Ooh,
things. You can actually collect those and use those to help season your venison. It's a flavor that goes really good with venison roast, and you can just take a bunch of those juniper berries and throw it in a brine, let your venison sit in there overnight, and it'll impart a little bit of that cedar juniper flavor into the meat, and I like it. I'm a fan.
yep. Good stuff. Now, don't eat the berries, but using them in that way is great for sure. And again,
For
you will
brine.
find we should clarify. So it's called Eastern red cedar, but as Curtis just hinted at, it's a juniper. It's not technically a cedar species. So just keep that in mind. There's some botany nerds out there that'll fight you over that. But one thing I do, just because he was talking about using it as cover scent, so I store all my camo in plastic totes. It's a great way just to keep everything as scent free as possible. Again, I have a couple dogs at home, so I basically get undressed in the parking lot, put all my stuff in a plastic tote, and then come home and then slick that plastic tote in my storage room. What I've started doing now, obviously, don't do this on public land because it's technically illegal to remove branches from public land. But if you know somebody, or if you happen to have a cedar branch or a cedar tree anywhere near you, I like to just go out and snip a branch, and then I put that in the bottom of my plastic tub with all my camo, and then now it just adds that extra aroma, like Curtis said. But now it adds it every time it's kind of sitting in there. So again, that's just some personal preference that I like to do. Again, does it help? I don't know, but it makes me feel better. And if it makes me feel better, I'm going to sit out there longer. And if I'm going to sit out there longer, I have a better chance of doing something.
Yeah, have you ever tried brining your deer with the juniper berries? That was a big meat eater thing there for a while.
I tried it once, yeah, and I did like it, but I just don't come across them enough. Yeah, but I would do it again for sure.
Sure, yeah, it's a little. It's kind of like a ginny flavor. That's not the same
It
that's
does have
used in
that.
gin.
Yeah,
Because okay, so red cedar is yeah, juniperous, and I think
Virginianus.
for gin they use Thuja occidentalis white cedar, which is a little different if I am not mistaken. But it's kind of reminiscent to that just a little bit, like a um, floral, citrusy, but also a little piney, but
Yeah,
not
it almost
overwhelming.
adds the same depth of flavors like a sage does. So it doesn't overtake a lot of the flavor, but it just adds this nice supplementary, yeah, kind of earthy. But any questions? We'll give it about 5 or 6 more minutes. We'll hang out with any questions. I know we had a few people come in late, so this webinar has been recorded, and we will throw it up on YouTube probably tomorrow. So you'll be able to watch the whole thing if you missed some of it or want to watch it again. But if you have any questions about deer hunting, about plant IDs, or anything else, we'll stick around and answer them. But thanks for joining us tonight. If you want to take off, I appreciate you joining us and hope you enjoyed it and hope you learned something.
And just while we're closing out here, seeing if any questions come in, I will read through the National Deer Association went through and categorized what they call the most important native deer foods in the Midwest. So most of these we went over, but I'll just read through this list real quick. We've got brambles, which includes the blackberries and the raspberries, coralberry, dogwoods, grape, greenbrier, Illinois bundleflower, ragweed, trumpet creeper, wild lettuce, and wild rose for the Midwest. That's according to the National Deer Association. They've got that posted on their
That's a
on
pretty
their
good list. I would
website.
agree. Yeah.
Yeah, so we covered most of those on there. We
And a
missed a
few of those
couple
I
of them.
thought of like Trumpet Creeper I was going to put in, but again, I really wanted to focus on like what's still relevant during deer season. So I have found, especially Trumpet Creeper, which is another vining plant. It's got a gorgeous flower, kind of bright orange, trumpet shaped flower. That's kind of how it gets its name. It's a really pretty annual vine, but a lot of times it's kind of already getting close to entering that dormancy period. Now, coralberry, that's one I don't see a lot in Illinois. I saw it quite a bit in southern Missouri, but I don't know that I've seen much of it in Illinois.
Yeah, and so this is broken down just by the Midwest. So it's broken down by region. So that's not specific to Illinois.
Oh, right, right, sure, sure. Oh, here's a question. Will native food sources overpower ag fields like corn and soybean? Great question, and typically no. Typically, and a lot of it depends where you're at too, specifically. So the areas I hunt are public land surrounded by just giant mega ag, right? So I mean, talking full sections, full square miles of corn and soybeans. Personally, I don't even. I started hunting. I went out this morning and got a few hours sit in before work, and I didn't see the level of activity that I should expect. And a lot of that is because these deer, especially in the areas I hunt, they can just live in that cornfield. Corn has plenty of cover, right? It's got plenty of food, obviously, and it's got plenty of water, whether it's, standing water in amongst the rows, or what a lot of people don't realize is a lot of the water that wildlife get is not necessarily from what they're drinking. A lot of times it's just what they're eating contains, already has decent amount of moisture content. So a lot of times deer are just getting a lot of their water from the stuff they're eating. And so typically I personally don't even really start hunting hard on the public lands I hunt until I start to see those crops get harvested. Now, luckily driving back from Des Plaines over the weekend, I started to see, I mean, there was harvesters out everywhere. So they're starting to harvest pretty heavily. So I imagine we're just a few days away from the area I hunt getting harvested because it was starting to. I mean, the corn looked ready, so I'd imagine they'll be out there any day now. But typically, once that stuff gets harvested, you'll see this natural. I don't want to say migration because it's not really a migration, but it seems like it, a migration back to the forest. And luckily, right at that transition, right when a lot of the crops start getting harvested, is when you're going to see kind of the peak of the mast crop season. And so I'm immediately going straight to basically hunting my white oak areas. And then I'll hunt those for a few weeks once I start seeing the deer activity lessen in those areas. Well, I will probably start to think a little bit on the red oak side. And by that time, we're probably getting a rut to where I'm not even going to be focused too much on thinking about hunting the food and focus more on hunting the doe bedding as the bucks come to check out those does. But yeah, so they definitely will. Ag overpowers native foods for sure. And that's why, for one, Illinois deer are huge, both in terms of antler size as well as body size compared to, some of the other states. Our deer are corn fed. That's why they taste so good too.
And yeah, it's ag is probably always going to overpower that stuff just in terms of that's where the getting is good. But also remember that deer are always going to eat a diverse diet. They're never going to eat only corn. So especially once hunting season gets going, they're really gonna relegate their time to feeding in those cornfields is gonna be mostly at night.
Yep.
And so it's going to be these secondary food sources that, yeah, is it as important to corn? Are they eating it as much as corn? No, but it's what they're eating during the daytime, which is when we can shoot.
And
You'll
if
find,
oh, go ahead, sorry.
yeah, I'd just say I would venture to guess probably 75% or more of all the corn that's eaten. And really, that's what we're talking about this time of year because soybeans are really highly used in like July. And then they seem to not be favored again for a while until later in the year. But corn this time of year, like Dan said, deer never even leave a cornfield. They don't have to. There's even famous bow hunters like Bob Folkrod who have made their whole career in hunting deer in standing cornfields with archery equipment. So that's absolutely a true thing. But the corn's all getting picked right now, and
Yep.
even when it's picked, they're still going to be eating it, but most of that's going to be at night.
And one thing that I like to bring up just to kind of expand on what Curtis said about this varied diet. Actually, I'm going to go back to the first slide just to show that because that's kind of why I started off with that illustration was to make that point. But what I really want to emphasize, and if you didn't take our bedding webinar that I gave, I think it was last week, they all start to run together after a while. It's on our YouTube page. But one thing I emphasized about bedding is oftentimes deer are going to obviously they're going to pick their bed that's got good cover, that's got good predator detection, but oftentimes, especially a buck, he's going to choose a bed that has the ability to browse not far from his bed. There's a lot of studies where they've, GPS collared or radio tracked deer and basically look at how much they're moving throughout a typical day. And again, there's a lot of variables at play there, but remember when deer are bedded, they're mostly bedded during the middle of the day. They're what we call crepuscular. So they're going to be active at those twilight hours, both at sunrise and at sunset. They're going to be feeding throughout the night. And then during the daytime, when we're hunting, a lot of times we're trying to get them coming back to their bed where they're going to be in their bed for most of the middle of the day. And so that's why I like to focus on food sources like this, because if you can start to identify those, not only does that help you try to pick out feeding areas, but now you've got an even better chance at identifying bedding areas. Because a lot of times these, especially a buck, he's just going to get out of his bed, stretch his legs, do a little circle. He may not walk more than 100 yards, feed a little bit, poop, pee, do his thing, and then he's back in his bed. And so oftentimes when I'm hunting public land, when I'm looking for these food sources, a lot of times I'm not like trying to find, oh, is there a stand of brambles or something? It's, oh, I see bedding, okay, and there's food, okay, and I'm starting to put all these pieces together. Now, we had another question about soybeans. So that's a really good question. Like Curtis mentioned, soybeans this time of year aren't really utilized that often by deer. And so the rule of thumb I like to follow, and there's, again, animals are wild, they can do whatever they want. This is definitely a generalization. But once I start seeing those soybeans turn yellow, the deer really seem to just avoid them. Late, throughout the summer, you can drive through soybean fields when those fields are lush, beautiful green, and you may see 10, 12 different bucks all sitting there feeding in that one field as they're out in kind of their bachelor group, does doing the same thing. But once that soybean starts to turn yellow, they kind of move off that food source and they really don't visit it again until like late winter. Again, what we call waste grain. So obviously, when you're out there harvesting standing crops, you don't always get 100% of either the corn or the soybeans or whatever that crop is. There's always going to be some residual crop left over. That's when I start to see them go back to those dried out beans, as in that very late winter period when again there's just not a lot of other food on the landscape. They may start to go digging in the snow and trying to find some of those waste grains. But for now, this time of year, I don't pay much attention to soybeans at all. And it's again, there's plenty of other food out there, plenty of better food out there this time of year. And once they start to turn yellow, they really steer clear of them.
Yeah, once
But
they
just
start
to,
to turn yellow, they're no longer browsing. Then they're only eating the actual
yeah,
soybean part of it,
good point. Yeah.
which yeah, they'll still browse on that a little bit, but it's a lot tougher to get at than usually all the spilled corn in a cornfield.
Yeah. And so your question about basically will they live in the soybean field? Not like they will a cornfield, like you said, just because it's shorter. They don't have that vertical cover like they do in a cornfield. And so oftentimes you'll see them going from a bedding area to that soybean field and then back to their bed.
A green soybean field is absolutely the best place to glass for bucks in
Yes.
like July, early August when it's still green. Especially bucks are really seeking out that as browse because it contains a high amount of protein and really good for their antler development. So you'll see the whole bachelor group just out there at dusk in the soybean field just chomping away.
And just to, I mean, soybean fields are very productive when they're still in that green stage. So again, I spent quite a few years hunting Kentucky, and Kentucky season, I don't want to say when it opened this year, but historically it used to open on September 1st. So about a full month before our season. So you're actually still getting to hunt when the deer are still actively using those soybeans. And I mean, that was basically our go-to strategy for hunting that very early season was just go out, walk that field and find the areas where all the tops are nipped off. You would literally find, okay, that one has no leaves. Okay, that one, and you just see like a circle. Okay, well, chances are they're feeding here. So I'm gonna get up in a tree right here and you'll probably arrow one. So soybeans are really great. Just unfortunately not so much in Illinois just because again, they've already started to turn yellow. Now, if they leave standing, so sometimes you'll see on a public site or even some farmers do it just to add some wildlife benefit to their operation. They'll leave a few rows of standing beans. I see those get hit quite regularly. Like the first snow event you get when everything else is covered, and if there's still some standing soybeans, even though they're brown at that stage, like Curtis said, they're not going to be obviously eating the leaves. They're going to be focused on the individual beans. But those are a really good food source. If I have a snow event and I happen to see a few rows or a nice plot of standing soybeans left during that snow event, I'm probably going to focus on those for sure. Anything to add, Curtis, or any other questions? We'll give it a few more minutes. Nice.
Seeing any more questions coming through, but yeah, we're right in that part of that graph where you see mass is getting real important. So especially as the cornfields get cut, that's really
Yep.
going to be a important food source here in October until we get into that really chasing, tending rut phase that's going to start hopefully right around the last few days of October. And then obviously the does are still going to be just worried about feeding, but the bucks are going to be almost not worried about feeding at all. They're only going to be worried about the does for a couple weeks. And so if you just find yourself a good doe bedding area and get downwind of that, and a trail in the woods and sit there and wait, good things will happen, hopefully.
True that. And I'll close out real quick with just a reminder. So we've started kind of this webinar series. Again, we throw them all up on YouTube. They get quite a few views out there. But we are going to have another webinar. I can't remember the date offhand. Maybe Curtis does, but it's a what we're calling a feeding special. And so it's going to be over the lunch hour. But again, if you can't make it live, it will be thrown up on YouTube. But we're going to dive even deeper into basically this chart specifically here. And so now we've had a webinar talking very specifically on bedding. Now, very specifically on just plants that deer hunters need to use. And then this next one, we're going to really focus on what do deer eat in Illinois. And so we're going to take a lot of that knowledge of that we just talked about in terms of plant and really kind of break that down to the next level. So that's going to be October 15th at noon. So that's next week. So if you have time over your lunch break, go ahead and pop in. And if not, again, we'll throw it up on YouTube. The day after, on October 16th, we'll be back at our 6 o'clock hour for a rut hunting webinar where I'm basically going to go through my entire season strategy for how I hunt rut, looking at deer behavior, deer ecology. I'm going to pull up some maps, tell some stories from hunts that went well, some hunts that went awful, and kind of what we can learn from those. So that'll be on October 16th at 6 p.m. And then if you're in the Chicago area, we have a really cool event on October 17th in Vernon Hills at the new Sitka store. So if you're familiar with Sitka, they're a clothing company that makes really nice camouflage and hunting gear. We're doing a hunting the rut kind of advanced tactics workshop, and we're going to have a wild game tasting component. So I think I'm going to cook up some basically venison, and we're going to do some taco. We'll have some ground deer meat for tacos, and then I may even thaw out a few steaks and do some kind of steaked meat too. But that should be a fun event. Registration is not required for that one for the Sitka, but we'll be there from probably 4 to 7 o'clock. So if you want to stop by, maybe check out some Sitka opportunities, sample some wild game, or learn a little bit more about rut. It should be a fun one.
Yeah, definitely try to hit that one up if you can. We're not for sure, but Sitka usually finds a way to award somebody in the crowd with something or another. So no promises, but who knows? There might be a surprise or two from Sitka in the store from that one.
Yep. And if you're just looking for a fun activity to spend a Friday night, hey, come join us. We'll be there. Should be a lot of
It's
fun.
a beautiful store too. They've got a lot of cool stuff. I days with the waders and the boots and the whole nine
Yeah.
yards, but they've pretty much got everything you could need clothing wise nowadays.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. And again, if you missed the first little bit, we'll throw this up on YouTube tomorrow so you can watch it again. And then hopefully we'll see you at a few other webinars and maybe some in-person stuff. But if you have any questions at any point, reach out to us, whether it's through Facebook, email, whatever. Our information is pretty much scattered all over the internet, so you can track us down and reach out to us. We love answering questions. We love looking at maps and tell us stories too. We love to hear those success stories. So we've already had some participants reach out that have had successful harvest already this year, so things are looking good out there. So we want to wish everybody a safe hunting season and a successful one, and we'll
Yeah, don't
catch you on the
forget to
next
wear
one.
your orange this weekend,
Yeah, good
everybody.
call. Good call. So this weekend,
Definitely.
yep, it's the firearm youth deer season, October 11th through the 13th. So wear your blaze orange if you're out archery hunting. Even if the property you're hunting at doesn't have kids out there or doesn't allow youth firearm deer hunters, you still need to have that blaze orange. So make sure to wear your vest and your cap that are 400 square inches of blaze orange or blaze pink if that fits you a little better. We won't judge. Awesome. All right. Well, we'll catch everybody on the next one. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.